Hello, History of Christianity students. I'd like to spend a little time with some slides getting up to and through Chalcedon, the Fourth Ecumenical Council. This is really a watershed in church history for a number of reasons, not all of which are good. In fact, many of which are very bad. It's something of a tragic council, though it's not usually seen that way in the West. We'll also include discussions of Councils 5 and 6, which, or at least outlines of them, which are far more cleaning up the mess of Chalcedon than they are dealing with unique problems in and of themselves. Unique problems did arise, but those unique problems are just part of the fallout of the type of decisions made at the Council of Chalcedon. By the end of Chalcedon, the East is divided between Oriental and Eastern Orthodox, a division which technically remains to this day, though those two groups of Christians are far closer to each other than pretty much any other two groups of Christians in the world that I know. And as I'd mentioned before in a previous slideshow, it's really just a handful of holdouts in the Eastern Orthodox Church that are preventing reunion of those two groups. So let's look at what leads to this crisis, and it follows directly off of the Third Ecumenical Council. The formula of 433, the formula of reunion proposed by John of Antioch, that's what we're talking about here, collapsed under the weight of four particular personalities. It did not collapse under the weight of serious argument. It collapsed under the weight of serious politics. The first, the big bully of Alexandria, a man, though sainted by the Oriental Orthodox, is not particularly loved even by them, at least the ones that I've talked to. Dioscorus is Cyril's successor, and he was certainly not interested in compromises in terminology with the Antiochenes. After all, compromises in terminology should be coming out of Alexandria, not Antioch. We are the ones to answer questions. The Antiochenes can go and pray and be pious and have their monks in the desert, which Egypt does too, of course, but they're welcome to function at a lower level. Alexandria should be calling the shots. His goal was complete vindication for anything that came out of Alexandria. And he didn't look at the Alexandrian position critically at all. He simply was an Alexandria fanboy. Anything that comes out of Alexandria, that's what he's following, that's what he's promoting. Flavian is another of the major personality problems, if you like, in this disagreement. He's Bishop of Constantinople after the Alexandrian-leaning Proclus died, so Flavian takes over in 449. He tended toward Antioch, though we aren't absolutely sure why, because he didn't leave anything that shows a lot of deep theological conviction on his part, in my opinion. The one thing he wasn't interested in is being bullied by Dioscorus. In other words, I think, and I'm not alone in this at all, I think that Flavian took the position of backing Antioch simply because he didn't like Dioscorus. And, Dioscorus is a mean person, so I'm going to back Antioch in this little fight. Pretty shallow, really. Eutyches was a very popular priest and monk in Constantinople, and he serves as something of a foil or a nemesis to Bishop Flavian. He supported strongly the Alexandrian position in a rather extreme form of it, and he supported it as a way of opposing Flavian. Even though I think Eutyches truly believed what he was doing, one of his goals was exposing Flavian for the shallow individual that Eutyches thought he was, and Eutyches was probably right about the shallow bit. But an extremely popular person with the masses, kind of rock star status, the type that only a true monastic could have in this day and age, he attacked Flavian publicly at a local council. And he argued that Christ had one nature, and this is where we get the term that defines the controversy, monophysis, and we call it the monophysite controversy, that Christ had one nature, one physis nature. The fourth major personality involved is Leo I, Pope of Rome. probably the overall nicest guy of the people who caused trouble in this controversy, he wrote a letter to Bishop Flavian of Constantinople in 449. This letter is known hereafter as the Tome of Leo, and it defended Flavian's moderate position and very specifically condemned Eutyches by name as an extremely foolish and altogether ignorant man. Now, this type of personal attack didn't play well politically, particularly since Eutyches was far more popular than Flavian. And when the tome was read in Alexandria, they said, "Oh, you're condemning Eutyches. That means, really, you're condemning the Alexandrians." It was understood that to condemn the Alexandrian position and to call it extremely foolish and altogether ignorant is to call Alexandria extremely foolish and altogether ignorant. Is this thin-skinned? Yes. But remember, Dioscorus, who pretty well defines thin-skinned and bitter and bully, is Patriarch of Alexandria. In 450, Pulcheria, a very pious woman who had actually been running the empire for quite some years as her dissolute and debauched relatives technically were emperor, Pulcheria comes to the throne, having married a general and a hard-nosed fellow himself, and a very pious fellow himself, Marcian, to give kind of a male-female legitimacy to the governance of the empire. It's hard at this point in time. You don't have such a view of women which supports a female empress in the East. This will change in the next 200 to 300 years, and you will have actual female empresses. But Pulcheria takes power. She agrees with her husband that they will not consummate their marriage, so both of them, in theory, and I'm sure it was true for Pulcheria, lived as monastics. And they both decide that this controversy has to end. The conflict over the divine and the human natures of Christ was seen as a cause of turmoil in the empire, and not a good thing. After all, given the fact that right now the barbarians are causing political turmoil in the West, and the West is in a state of perpetual civil war and basically useless. Civilization is declining rapidly in the minds of the people of Constantinople when they look to places like Italy and Spain. There's plenty of turmoil. We sure don't need anything more in the church. And this turmoil is particularly acrimonious. So they call another council, which met in the autumn of 451 in the town of Chalcedon. Again, just across the Bosporus, not far from Nicaea, just across the Bosporus from Constantinople. Regional politics messed things up from the beginning. Look how this falls out and see why it doesn't work. As soon as the council convened, Dioscorus was immediately condemned without much discussion and deposed. Alexandria saw this as an act of payback for the immediate deposing and condemning of Nestorius. In fact, of course, in 431, Nestorius was deposed and condemned before the Nestorians had even arrived. Well, something similar, as far as the Alexandrians go, is happening to Dioscorus. So this looks like payback for what Kirill had done to Nestorius. This means that the Alexandrians are seeing things through very colored glasses. Every decision made at the council is interpreted as being anti-Alexandrian. So there's not a whole lot of consciousness that there may be some room for compromise here on the part of the Alexandrian faction. To be clear, the Alexandrian group and their supporters didn't really support Dioscorus either, or Eutyches. But the question was, is this really directed at us, as Alexandria? Are we being condemned as a group here because of the behavior of our enemies? The Antiochene critics of Cyril were rehabilitated, and this was probably a bad move because Cyril was a very moderate person when it came to the debate, not when it came to personality, but he was a very moderate person in the debate over against somebody like Dioscorus or someone like Eutyches. Cyril was willing to acknowledge that that the terminology had to be worked out. So when his critics are rehabilitated, it looks like the moderate position of the Alexandrians is also under attack. See how that goes. The first thing you do is condemn Dioscorus before there is any real discussion. The second thing you do is support the critics of the Alexandrian moderate position. So it looks like an attack on Alexandria. Kirill's interpretation of the formula of reunion. Now this is a bit strange. After rehabilitating Kirill's opponents, the one thing they try to do is kind of stop the gap or keep the dam from blowing here. They adopt Cyril's interpretation of the formula of reunion, which they could have done years ago and saved all this problem. This was accepted over against Nestorius. So note, while rehabilitating the critics of Cyril, they compromise. This is why we shouldn't trust committees too far. They compromise and say, well, although the critics of Cyril weren't that bad, Cyril did get the whole thing right in 431 to 433. He understood what John of Antioch was saying, and his moderate compromise is perfectly fine. Pretty confusing. Leo's tome was declared to agree with Cyril. I don't think it quite does. I don't think Leo's Greek was good enough for his tome to agree with Cyril. I don't think, Leo's Pope of Rome. He's a nice guy. He's a sincere fellow, but he stuck his foot in an Eastern debate where he was completely out of his league. By declaring Leo's tome to agree with Cyril, the Alexandrians being, led by the thin-skinned Dioscorus, and being convinced that this whole thing was set up as a trap for the Alexandrians, it looks like they're siding with kind of a Western simpleton over against the sophisticated position of Alexandria. It was not only declared to agree with Cyril, it was adopted as the statement of orthodoxy over against Eutyches. Now, you've picked somebody whose knowledge of Greek is not particularly good, who has a simple personal letter to Flavian, although it was meant to be read publicly, and the letter itself bungles an awful lot of the definitions involved in the debate, and this is declared to be the official position of Chalcedon. At this point, it's not only the Alexandrians who say, okay, that one's dubious. There are others as well, but because of, again, a need to condemn something, I think, the vote goes with Leo's tome. I say this not to insult the Pope. Leo was a nice Pope. He was a bit full of himself, and he did, like most of the West, resent the idea that in the previous council, Constantinople had been declared superior to Rome. Okay, that in itself isn't a bad thing to be offended at. After all, Rome had always had pride of place because of having the martyrs Peter and Paul martyred in that city. But from the Eastern perspective, Rome had just been sacked 40 years earlier by the Goths. Rome was in desperate shape culturally and politically and financially, and the Pope of Rome may be nice enough, but he certainly is not a theological heavyweight. The resolution which was accepted, had to be explained many times over in the next centuries. There is one prosopon, face, and one hypostasis in two natures. Huh? And what do you mean by nature? Okay, we've rejected, it looks like nature is simply adopted as a rejection of monophysis. You say there are diaphysis. Okay, what does the word mean? Does it mean physical reality? That's bizarre. There's a very narrow definition. Very few would have followed that at the time. How is nature different from a hypostasis? There's almost more terminological problems with this than with the formula of reunion of 433. Reaction. In the West, Chalcedon, focused as it was on Leo's tome, was regarded as the proper orthodox settlement of the problem of the two natures. In other words, hey, our side won. Our Western Pope's definition is the definition of orthodoxy. End of discussion. Pardon me. And this is pretty much where the West remained and remains till this day for those who even think about it. The Roman Church, pardon me, I'm drinking my tea. The Roman Church, not surprisingly, backs their Pope. The Lutherans like the systematic nature in which things are laid out in the Tome of Leo, though the Lutherans also added to the discussion. It's an interesting thing when Lutheranism finally develops in the 16th century. They read this, say, yup, that's pretty much it, but we need to make some adjustments based on Scripture. Well, that attitude, if you make it a little darker, is how the East accepted the Tome of Leo. Well, that's pretty much it, but it's written by a shallow individual, and we need to make some adjustments based on Scripture. The West was not happy, however, with the declaration that the See of Constantinople, meaning the power of the regional bishop in Constantinople, was equal to that of Rome. This is actually a step down from the previous council, which said Constantinople is superior to Rome. Now they're kind of sharing power, but there's a development in Rome, and I think it has a lot to do with their isolation, their cultural decline, and the sense of circle the wagons that comes with constant civil war in the West. There was a sense that the Bishop of Rome is one of the few things that gives us stability. It is the true single main bishopric of the Church of Christ on earth. In other words, in the 5th century, you start seeing an attitude among the Roman, or among the Western Church, that Rome has to have priority over all else, not just in pride of place, but also in authority. And this clearly didn't happen at Chalcedon. In the East, opinion was divided, and so was the Church. There's a sense, even among the so-called winning side, that Chalcedon really hadn't accomplished what it set out to accomplish. Some regarded the conclusions of Chalcedon as establishing an official position, which, although far from perfect, that's kind of the Chalcedonian crowd, could be carefully interpreted to avoid the extremes of Nestorius on the one hand and Dioscorus and Eutyches on the other. Others, especially in Syria, objected to the wholesale condemnation of Nestorius. It's important to note, I think, that they didn't reject the condemnation of Nestorius. After all, Nestorius had gotten some things wrong. But they rejected the way in which nothing was accepted or nothing was even considered in Nestorius. It's a more subtle thing than flat-out Nestorianism. Though they are remembered as the Nestorians. They eventually formed a breakaway Nestorian church, which had moderate Nestorian leanings at least, which was forced eastward into Persia and the Church of Iran. That's Persia to you and me. The Church of Iran, through most of its history, up until the radicalization of Iran, was a fairly moderate Nestorian group and traces its history all the way back here, considerably before Islam. There's a powerful Christian movement that is the breakaway Nestorian group. Ironically, the Nestorian group has largely melded with, what was left of them, melded with their opposite number in the entire debate, the non-Chalcedonians, or the Oriental Orthodox. Weird, huh? That means the debates themselves had less to do with doctrine and more to do with personality, as I've been saying all along. There were widespread objections also in the East to the Tome of Leo, even among the Chalcedonians, even among the so-called winning side. It was a simplistic answer to a difficult question, written by someone whose Greek was too poor to properly understand the debate. The West is starting to catch on that the East looks down on them as a bunch of backward barbarians, and they start to resent this. Unfortunately, if we measure barbarism by lack of sophistication in education, loss of culture, and political turmoil, the West was a bunch of backward barbarians. That's a fairly good way to measure it at this point. If Leo's tome was not openly Nestorian, as the Alexandrians would claim, and it really wasn't, it certainly allowed room, if you interpreted it right, for Nestorianism in the minds of most Eastern bishops. This two natures thing was simply way too wide open. Alexandria had the most radical reaction because they thought the whole council was called to condemn Alexandria, not a bad theological position. and the majority rejected Chalcedon wholesale as a council which had betrayed traditional Eastern theology and rejected the opinions of Alexandria without a hearing. Rome, in the minds of the Alexandrians, had hijacked the council. Politically, the East was divided between those who believed that unity with the West was paramount, now I mean politically as in politically, and those who believed that the Roman See had engaged in a high-handed power grab. In other words, why did we allow them to be equal with Constantinople? And politically, we need to reunite the empire. We need to get the Germans in check. We need to rein in the generals, because the Germans aren't really the only problem by this point. We need to rein in the generals who are causing civil war in the 5th century, and we need to get the empire back on a proper footing. And this does not mean that acknowledging a backward bishop in Rome to be equal with Constantinople is a good thing. We've just basically given the barbarian side of the empire equal status in the church with the non-barbarian side of the empire. That's how it's seen in Constantinople. Fallout. Complicating the Chalcedonian resolution were several factors which ensured that the division between the Chalcedonians and the Monophysites, as they're known to this day, though incorrectly, were permanent. Politics. The point of the settlement was to establish an enforceable peace between the factions. The emperors, in succession, tried to bring along all the parties, but when persuasion failed, military coercion was often used. In other words, Chalcedon didn't work to settle the issue. The two groups are in tension, sometimes absolute physical, violent tension, with, you read about in the textbook, with people being stoned to death. This is probably the darkest period of Christian conflict with Christians. Actually, it's probably the darkest period of Christian violence that I know of, because I don't consider your Crusades to be a period of Christian violence. I consider it a land grab, as does Dr. Stanfield Johnson. So really nasty physical violence breaks out, and honestly, the emperors probably started, or certainly exacerbated this. Whenever you can't get the parties to live with each other, they'd send in the army and just start killing people. Emperors had a bad way of governing at this point. The Egyptian mobs who supported the Monophysites reacted to the coercion of the emperors with violence, as mobs often do. What happens when you go in and start shooting things at mobs? They start throwing things back. Now they lose, but they also can cause a lot of damage along the way, as in the case of the lynching of the Chalcedonian bishop of Alexandria, who had been imposed upon them by the emperor. They drag him out and hang him. That's pretty nasty. Did the emperor's behavior start it? Yeah, but that's absolutely no excuse, now is it? Suspicion. The so-called Monophysites had no use for the interference of the Roman bishop in the debate, and there's still a resentment of all things Western among the Alexandrian Syrian crowd who are not Chalcedonians, and I know some of them quite well. And they regarded the Chalcedonian Council as an unholy alliance between the backward Roman bishops and the empire, in which Constantinople had betrayed the Eastern cause by basically siding with this bizarre power grab on behalf of the West. This suspicion tainted many compromises which might have been workable. Add to this that the West is dominated by barbarian Aryan Germanic tribes, and the sense that the heretics somehow won the day is understandable for the Alexandrians. More violence, and this time not mob violence, violence from the outside. Warfare swept across Palestine, Syria, and Egypt, first in the Persian invasions, which was a standard, kind of the bog standard conflict between Rome and Persia that, if you study classical history, you're used to. The Persian invasions at the end of the 6th century, and next, in the surprise from the desert, the Islamic invasions of the early 7th century. This effectively isolated the Monophysites in several nationally based churches, which were not able to engage in the later discussions. Had they been able to engage, things might have turned out much, much differently. The Eastern Orthodox, who supported Chalcedon, and the Oriental Orthodox who oppose it are divided to this day. and I think tragically so. And Persians and Islam had as much to do with that as the original political problem. The irony is that both the Eastern and Oriental Orthodox reject the extremes of Nestorius and Dioscorus Eutyches. In other words, both reject the things that were technically condemned. Modern scholars realize that when you start counting heads, there were really no real Monophysites among the non-Chalcedonians. You have some people leaning that way, you have some people leaning against Chalcedon. Mostly what you have is political factions. Today, there is a movement that I've mentioned before toward reunification of the Eastern Christians, which entails a tacit rejection of the interference of the West. In other words, for those of you hoping and praying for a reunion of the Eastern and Western churches, that's not going to happen first, if ever, because the union of Oriental and Eastern means that they see the Pope and the papacy as part of the problem with the entire development of church history. And if they do reunify, it will be as a kind of united front against the power of the papacy, which got out of hand in this interpretation in Chalcedon. Subsequent Western history suggests to the leaders of these two groups, which explains why we have the attitude we do to this day in the East, that the Western form of Christianity was seriously flawed already at the time of Leo. Not only were they high-handed and power-hungry, they were heretics. There are modern political implications here, as you might expect. So a few more considerations in this particular slideshow. This is the final slide. We'll talk about Councils 5 and 6, which in many ways are part of the fallout to Council 4. The Fifth Ecumenical Council, also the Council of Constantinople, this is why we stop using cities after a point and simply refer to the date, or the Council of 553, was a council in which the West was largely excluded, not necessarily by intention, but by the fact that the Western culture had so disintegrated, and the Western economic system had so disintegrated that there was no real way for them to participate. There was some representation there from the Court of Rome, but by and large this is an Eastern conference, which is why as the Lutherans in the time of the Reformation looked back over history and decided, what councils really mattered, they kind of stopped at 4, because after 4 the West isn't participating much anymore. The points made at Chalcedon were clarified at the Fifth Ecumenical Council in a way that clearly rejected the possibility of Nestorianism, which most of the delegates there thought was latent in the Tome of Leo. To wit, the Fifth Ecumenical Council declared that God died. It is legitimate to say that because God became human, God died in his human flesh, as the God-man Jesus, even as God was born. So Mary is Theotokos. The cross is also Theotokos, a bearer, in Eastern theology we even call it a birth giver to Christ, that part of his birthing process, he's born of Mary, but he's also born into the new life through experiencing human death and then creating new life by rising from the grave. The Fifth Ecumenical Council also condemned the writings of certain Antiochians who had been rehabilitated by Chalcedon. Think about this. This is what torqued off the Alexandrians to begin with. You brought back the Alexandrians, or you brought back the Antiochians that were most combative in the previous discussion, and that seemed to be a slight on Alexandria. Well, in the Fifth Ecumenical Council, these same folks who had been rehabilitated, the objectionable ones, were rejected in their writings, at least. The position of the Oriental Orthodox bishops today, and particularly that of now the late Pope Shenouda of Alexandria, I know because I had a good conversation with him on this, is that Chalcedon is perfectly acceptable to the Egyptian or to the Indian or to the Syrian churches or to the Ethiopian churches, if it is interpreted according to the Fifth Ecumenical Council, which properly clarified everything. So the problem was the Orientals also really couldn't make it there because of
the difficulty traveling at the time of the Persian invasions, and just lack of resources from being politically on the outs with the emperor. Yeah, where are the Orientals located today? That might be worth noting. Egypt, understandably. There are two functioning churches in Syria. One is Oriental, one is Eastern Orthodox. The Eastern Orthodox, I believe, is the larger one. Ethiopia, the Church of Ethiopia, which is very few people are aware that Christianity under Haile Selassie, and before Christianity was the official religion of Ethiopia, it was a Christian empire in Africa. And much more needs to be written on this in English so people can learn about that fascinating history of Ethiopia. And one of my favorite places, I mean, all throughout what we call the Mideast now and the Far East, you have Oriental Orthodox. One of my favorites is India. The church in Kerala, from Mumbai south to the tip, is effectively Oriental Orthodox. And I just love the folks from that area. I have a lot of good friends who are Indian Orthodox, including now of blessed memory, Barnabas Teromini, who was a tremendous bishop, lived a very simple life, very humble man, but a very powerful man also. I often imagine in my head that Athanasius must have been an awful lot like Barnabas Teromini because of the popular following that a monastic can gain when he plays his cards right. Of course, if you know Barnabas Teromini, you also know he was 4 foot tall when he was alive. He lived to age 106, which is also kind of nifty, puts him in the class with Anthony of the Desert. But yeah, 4 foot tall, so I got in the habit of calling him Bishop Yoda, which kind of caught on with the young Indian Orthodox I was hanging out with at the time. Don't know that he ever understood what Yoda meant. I'm kind of glad of that. Nicolavos Teromini, his right-hand man in America, Bishop Nicolavos, was just the opposite. He's 6'4", so watching the two of them walk side by side was always entertaining. That's a real tangent. The Sixth Ecumenical Council, Constantinople again, 680 to 681. What did it do? The West was largely excluded again because they were busy sorting out their barbarian identity, which is what I'll probably talk about in the next slideshow. It rejected a kind of variant form of monophysitism called monothelitism, which allowed for two natures in Christ but only one will. No, Christ had two wills: a human will which craved food and water and a good glass of wine after a long day walking around Galilee, a human will which could truly recoil at the horror of the crucifixion that Christ was undergoing, and a divine will. So he did experience every aspect of our being. That's the key there. Monothelitism was considered really one of the unacceptable compromises between the idea of two natures and the non-Chalcedonian position. That's how it had come in. Since it had developed as a way of compromising, I don't think it was ever very large. An emperor had kind of proposed it as a compromise, but it winds up rejected at the Sixth. Since Christ was both completely God and completely human, it follows, according to the Sixth Ecumenical Council, that Christ had two wills: a human will, which was subject to his divine will, as in the anguish of the Garden of Gethsemane. Again, the Oriental Orthodox are willing to accept this so long as it means that Jesus wasn't some kind of weird split personality. For the sake of understanding the history of Christianity, one of the key features at this point, after the Fifth and Sixth Ecumenical Councils, is to note the widening gulf between East and West. The West, not through intention, but through political and economic reality, doesn't wind up at these councils. Now, the Roman Church accepts them. They're perfectly accepted in the Roman Church, but as I've already mentioned, the Protestants get a bit dubious after Council 4. A fine point, however, about the difference between East and West comes with the Quinisext or Trullan Council, held in the kind of domed foyer of the emperor's palace, the Trulla. So it's called the Trullan Council. There's some mention of this on page 183, in your book 183. It occurred in the year 692, What the Trullan, or what the Quinisex Council did, was take all previous statements of canons, regular behaviors um, of the hierarchy of the church. How should it operate? Going back and looking over the Eastern practices, and basically establish a framework within which you could operate according to legitimate practice of the church. This was to regularize some things, and this was to ensure that no crazy ideas kind of took over the church. What happens then is, and this is key with understanding canons, there's no such thing in the East as canon law. These are all guidelines for bishops to follow. As long as they operate pretty much within these guidelines, they have a certain freedom. They also have freedom to break the guidelines, because after all, they're only guidelines, but they should do so in an orderly manner that reflects the gospel. This is the idea of canons in the East. This is the rules by which we live. And so I have a rule that says I fast every Wednesday and Friday from all animal products, but that rule may be broken when I'm traveling, because after all, it's a guideline. It's a rule or a way of living, not a legis, not a law. And God won't punish me for having an egg on a Friday morning. It's just that my spiritual discipline suffers, the same as not doing my push-ups on a Friday morning, which has been quite a while, I'm afraid, since I did them. In the West, canons become law, and the concept of church order is understood in terms of crime and punishment. You violate the canons, you have violated law. You violate the canons in the East, you're going to have a talk with your life coach, your priest, or your spiritual guide, or it could be a mother confessor as well. And they're going to talk over whether that's good for you, whether you're making good choices. But skipping the fast on Wednesdays and Fridays doesn't lead to excommunication. An interesting point in the same canons, the same guidelines, if I skip church 3 Sundays in a row when I could have made it, now this doesn't apply when I can't make it, but when I could have made it, technically I don't get communion the next Sunday either, because they're wondering why anyone in their right mind would skip the Eucharist when they didn't have to. What type of Christian isn't dedicated to the presence of Christ in communion? Now, that canon's set aside a lot too. I don't know of that canon being enforced, but I'm using it as an example of a guideline. This is why a priest might have reason to come and seriously talk to you about your spiritual well-being. You're skipping church all the time. You're not coming to receive the body and blood of the Lord. Is there something you're not telling me? Clear it up, and then you come back to the chalice. So it's a guideline for spiritual care. Among the canons that clearly will separate East and West, though they're in Eastern Rite Roman Catholic churches, they follow the canons of the Quinisex Council, interestingly. Very close to Orthodox. Married priests. The Quinisex Council determines that it's not a good idea for bishops to be married, even though they were in the early church. The jobs of a bishop are simply too rigorous if they're doing their job well, and you don't want, given the power of a bishop, you don't want that power being inherited, father to son to son to son to son, indefinitely. Bishops are not supposed to have that type of earthly inheritance. Well, there are plenty of monastics to choose from. They tend to make pretty good bishops. And so the Quinisex says bishops, yep, they are celibate monastics, essentially. Some of them were married, for 30 or 40 years, retired to a monastery, become bishops. This can happen as well. But a priest, according to the Quinisex Council, can and probably should be married. It's often a good idea to have a married man serving the local parish. And so Orthodox priests tend to be married. We also have monastic priests, about 10% really. It's a good ballpark figure for the monastic, the celibate priests. Every celibate priest is a monastic in the Orthodox Church. Of course, the same council determines that. And about 90% of our priests have wives and kids. So just regular married life. The one rule, though, that is established with all higher orders, again at the Council of Trullo, I'm just giving you some examples of how the East is distinctive here. If a priest's wife leaves him or dies, the priest does not remarry. The priest is permitted at that point to petition for entry into monastic orders if he likes, but you're not to be remarried. You don't want your priest on the meat market. If you are going to get married, you have to get married before you're ordained, so that sacrament, the sacrament of marriage, has to be established before you become part of the clergy. The idea being, and here's where this is all really practical if you think about it, the idea being you want a stable, reliable dude being the pastor of the local parish. You want somebody who is not going to, chase all the young hotties in his little corner of Athens when his wife dies. So the vow of priesthood is a vow of perpetuity with one wife, and that marriage has to occur prior to ordination. In theory, it also follows a principle that is very scriptural, which is that the first wife a person has is the wife of his youth. Check it out in the Old Testament, how that phrase is used, you Christian types, you. The wife of one's youth is your true wife. And answer questions on this from the book of, for instance, Matthew, when the Sadducees come to try to trick Jesus and they don't even know the scriptures well enough to realize the first wife is the wife, or in that case, the first husband is the true husband. There's certainly a divorce did occur and does occur in the Orthodox Church. We don't hide it or try to call it an annulment or something like that. It happens, but it's an exception to the rule. Again, canon. It is exception to the canon. Sometimes it's necessary, but it's an exception to the canon. The key understanding here also, and this is how I think this is a good example to let you know how many levels the canons really function in Orthodoxy. The idea of having one wife as being an ideal. If you're not monastic, you have only one wife or only one husband. That idea is because Christ has only one bride, the church, and the church has only one husband, Christ. So this marriage between Christ and the church metaphor that you see in the book of Ephesians is taken very seriously in the Eastern Church, and every marriage should be, ideally, an icon, a metaphor, an image of the perfect relationship between God and his people. For those of you who are getting bored by the spiritual side of this, there's also a very earthly side of this. There is a particular emperor who winds up because his wives keep accidentally dying young. And in this case, I don't think oops, I pushed her down the stairs and she accidentally died. I don't think that was going on. I think he genuinely thought, he would have a lot of years with these gals. He kept remarrying, and the church excommunicated him because he didn't accept that, you're going through wives like facial tissue, dude. This is not the way we treat marriage. The purpose of marriage is not just to have kids. The purpose of marriage is to have an enduring relationship. And if that isn't working out for you for whatever reasons, maybe you ought to take a step back. Don't get so excited, especially when your wives are dying in childbirth. Maybe there's something going on here that isn't particularly to be repeated. So that becomes a major political blowout in the Byzantine Empire, and it has fascinating ramifications throughout the court politics of the empire. Talk a lot more about that one in Byzantine history. Well, that certainly covers this slide and then some, so I'm going to check out now, get ready for the next phase of this wonderful conference I'm at, and leave you to thinking these things over and looking forward to the next set of slides, which is going to be on conversion. So take care.